So this week we are going to talk about this chapter from Laura Ekstrom on the mystery of free will, or Mysterianism, as it's sometimes called. So let's start by we'll get to Mysterianism towards the end as well, when she kind of more straightforwardly addresses the argument from Peter Van Inwagen for Mysterianism. But let's just kind of um, pump this intuition and motivate this idea that free will is a mystery and what that means. So why is there even this idea that free will is a mystery? Well, two kind of main reasons, and again, one that we'll get to a little bit more in a little bit more detail below. But the first idea is that libertarianism, libertarian free will, right, is seems kind of mysterious, seems kind of odd. And we've talked about libertarianism for the past couple weeks now, so hopefully it's intuitive now that you've seen some of these views that there is a little bit of mystery to libertarian free will, and in particular to agent causal libertarianism. Right? So if you remember, event causal libertarianism just kind of takes up this, what is at least thought to be, this sort of more ordinary notion of causation. Causation between events. One event happens, molecules knocking into each other, or chemical substances undergoing certain processes, and then that event causes some other event, but it causes it indeterministically, meaning that one event or one process in the world allows for different possible processes or events to follow. Right? So you might drop a vase, and depending on how fragile it is, it may or may not break. Right? Or it may break into 100 pieces, or it may break into 90 pieces. Right? So if you assume indeterminism, as the libertarians do, determinism cannot be true, right, for libertarians, you get this idea that event causal libertarian views say that, well, look, causation is between events, and one event just indeterministically or probabilistically causes some other event. But once you move to agent causal libertarianism, the idea that causation is not just about two events lining up together, right? Like one event causing another event, but causation is about, sometimes at least, is about agents or substances causing events. And they do so in a special kind of way. And if you remember, agent causal libertarianism introduces this power. It's like special power to cause actions. Agents have this power to cause actions, like to cause decisions or to cause overt behaviors like moving your arm, in a way that's not caused by something else. So the agent causal power is this power to be an uncaused cause of your actions. You cause your actions with this power, but you're not caused to do it. If you remember from O'Connor, your reasons, the antecedent previous circumstances you're in before the action, those things can structure your power. They can kind of influence your power, but they do so, they structure it, they influence it without causing it. And so this idea that you have this power to cause things, but without being caused to do it, it's kind of spontaneous. Remember the radioactive decay analogy? It just seems a little mysterious. Okay, that these things can influence you, but they don't really make the final determination, not even probabilistically. They don't even just set the probabilities of what you'll do and then leave it at that. And then, now it's just up to whatever probability. It's something else, something over and above the probabilities. You have the power with this agent causal power to rise above the probabilities that are set by the reasons, the circumstances, your character, your mental states, and to just cause things without these things really determining them, without them even probabilistically setting them. And that's a little mysterious. Okay, so libertarianism, especially agent causal power libertarianism, can seem a little bit mysterious. And so there is a concern about free will mystery. But now there's a completely separate worry about mystery, right? So the agent causal libertarians like Timothy O'Connor, who we read last time, and others, Randy Clark and um, Roderick Chisholm, other people who have this libertarian view, this agent causal libertarian view. There is a mystery there, but it's a mystery about sort of how the free will power works, right? This other kind of Mysterianism from Peter Van Inwagen, the kind that Ekstrom addresses kind of both of these worries a little bit, but she's a lot more focused on Peter Van Inwagen's argument for what he called Mysterianism. And this is different. This is not, hey, this power that you have is kind of mysterious. How does that work? Peter Van Inwagen's Mysterianism is more like, how can we even have free will? Like, how can free will even be possible? Not because the power that we have to talk about is weird and it's like a spontaneous power and we're not sure how that works. It's more like, if he says, and again, we'll see this below, but the basic idea is like, if you think about the arguments, it's really not clear how free will is even possible. So he accepts this argument called the consequence argument, and this is the basic idea. Peter Van Inwagen thinks that these three things are true. Okay. He thinks these three things are true. If our actions are determined, we don't have free will. If our actions are determined, if the world is governed by deterministic laws of nature, so there's only one possible future, we can't have free will. And his evidence is the consequence argument, which we saw, where if you're powerless over the laws of nature, and you're powerless over the fact that the laws of nature and the past, and you're powerless over the fact that the past and the laws of nature guarantee your action, guarantee one future, then you're powerless over that future. You're powerless over that action that's guaranteed by the past and the laws of nature. So you can't do anything else, and if you can't do anything else, you're not free. So if we're determined, then we're not free. And Peter Van Inwagen accepts this. But also, if our actions are not determined, if our actions are indeterministic, then we don't have free will also. And this is what we saw with the luck argument. And Peter Van Inwagen has a particular a version of the luck argument that's sometimes it's called the mind argument because he wrote a paper about it and the paper was published in a journal called Mind. But it's just a luck argument. But another term that gets used for this argument, his version, is called the rollback argument. And so we saw this where you have the setup where you have some particular past, the history of the world unfolds, and it goes up to some moment in time where you're about to make a decision, and then you have two or more, at least two, different possible outcomes that you could do, two different possible choices. Now let's pretend you choose A, right? Then Peter Van Inwagen says, if the world is not determined, so you have different possibilities, then there's going to be some probability. The laws of nature are going to be probabilistic, so that you're going to have some probability of doing A, whatever that is, and it can't be one, right? Because that would just be determinism. So some probability like 99% or 50% or 60% or whatever of doing A, and then the other probability of doing B. So if it's 99A, then 1B, or 50-50 A and B, or 60% A, 40% chance of B. So whatever the probabilities are, if the world is not determined, then there's going to be some probability for each different possibility. But if that's true, then we just roll back the universe to your moment of choice over and over and over. Same exact history, same exact circumstances, same exact agent, but now they can do different things. In one world they do A, in another rollback they do B, in another rollback they do B again, another rollback they do A, another rollback they do B, and A and A and B and A and B and A, and back and forth. And the question is, or the upshot, the point of the luck argument is, nothing except for chance determines what world you'll be in, whether you do A or B. Nothing about you really makes a difference because you're exactly the same. So we need an explanation for why you ended up in the world where you did A instead of the world where you did B, and it just seems like a matter of chance, a matter of luck. Okay, that's the luck argument. And Peter Van Inwagen thinks the luck argument is good, is a good argument. It's a sound argument. It works. And the conclusion of that argument is, if the world is not determined, then we don't have free will. So if the world is determined, we don't have free will. If the world is not determined, we don't have free will. But then the third claim he thinks is true is that we do have free will. And his evidence is, we won't talk about very much, but mainly is that people are responsible and you can't be responsible unless you're free. So that's the basic claim. And so the idea is that, look, all of these can't be true. These all can't be true because these two lead to the fact that we don't have free will. And then he says, but wait, we do have free will. And obviously that's a contradiction. We can't have free will and not have free will. That's a contradiction. So one of the ideas, these all can't be true, but he doesn't see how any of them can be false. If we just look at each one individually, it's like, well, this one has to be true. Okay, let's look at this one. This has to be true. This has to be true. But they can't all be true together. And so that is the mystery, right? Each individually, it seems like each one is true, but they can't all be true together. So that is a mystery. And he does not want to give this up. And he doesn't see how we can give these up. So that's the mystery. How can we have free will? It seems like we have to say that we have it, but it also seems like there's arguments against it that work. So what do we do? And he can't see what's wrong with these arguments. So, all right, we'll come back to that below. But that just motivates the idea. This is what she is addressing. This kind of mystery of how we even understand how free will works. This agent causal power stuff seems mysterious. And how can we even have free will? Because it seems like there's good arguments that we don't have free will, but it also seems like there's good arguments, maybe from moral responsibility or intuition, um, that we don't, or excuse me, that we do have free will. And so, how can we even make sense of the possibility of free will given these arguments? Excuse me. So sorry. Okay, so let's look at how she starts the paper. So she says, look, first, we need to have an understanding of what free will is. Okay. She wants to put a conception of free will, kind of a definition of free will on the table. And she starts by saying, let's appeal to Gary Watson, who has a couple famous papers on how to understand free will and responsibility. She points to an older article, I think it's called Free Action and Free Will. Um, but there's another article from Gary Watson called Two Faces of Responsibility. And he has this kind of idea, Gary Watson, that free will has really two components and responsibility. What makes someone free, what makes an action free, what makes an action responsible, sort of really comes down to two fundamental things. One is about autonomy. It's about the action coming from you, being self-determined, self-governed, being an action that expresses or represents or flows from your true self. Okay, so the first component of free will, the first component that makes an action free is that it was autonomous. It came from yourself in the right way. Okay. So that's the first way. So free will has sort of two pieces to it, and one of them is that the action has to be autonomous, has to be self-determined, self-governed, and this is just about the action flowing from you in the right way, flowing from your true self, right? And not some alien state within you that's not really a part of your true self. Think about like people acting out of character, or having a neuroscientist implant a chip in their brain, and then the chip makes their brain fire in certain ways and then makes them perform an action. That's not really flowing from the person's true self, you might think. Kind of this alien cause. Right? And autonomy seems like it's pretty compatible with determinism. And Gary Watson thought this, and most people now kind of think this. There's this like one component of free will that is pretty straightforwardly compatible with determinism. And why is that? Well, because it's not autonomy, having an action be determined by you or governed by you or coming from you, and more particularly, flowing or coming from your true self. That's not really about being able to do otherwise. That's not really about having different alternative possibilities. That's just about your action being caused in the right way, being caused by the appropriate thing, you, and the right parts of you. So as long as your action is caused by you, and where what we mean by caused by you is caused by the parts of you that we consider to be genuine, genuinely you or genuinely representative of you. So you might think like caused by the right kind of desire or the right kinds of beliefs. And that's exactly the way Ekstrom's going to understand this, and we'll see in a minute. But the idea is it's not about having different options. It's just about the action being caused in the right way. And if it's just about being caused in the right way, then it doesn't matter if you have alternative possibilities, right? It doesn't matter that your action could have been another action. It just matters that your action was caused in the right way. And determinism doesn't threaten that because determinism takes away alternative possibilities, at least in a certain sense, but it doesn't take away the fact that you cause your actions, right? You can desire something and believe something and want something and have a certain mental makeup, right? A certain physical and mental makeup, and then that being in that certain physical and mental state causes you to do something. Determinism is okay, totally compatible with that. It's just that on determinism, only one thing can happen if you're in some particular state. Uh, but again, like autonomy, it doesn't matter that only that only one thing can happen. It just matters that that whatever happens is caused by the true you or the parts of you that are representative of the true self. So the second part of free will is about the ability to do otherwise. So not only is free will about autonomy, about being caused by your true self, actions coming from you, but it's about your actions not being determined. Okay, so the second part of free will that Ekstrom says that we need to capture, and Gary Watson points this out as well, that there's this sense of um, needing to have a fair opportunity to do otherwise. Free acts must have genuine possible alternatives, meaning if an action is going to be free, not only does it have to be autonomous or self-determined, but it also has to be true that you could have done something else. You could have avoided that action if you wanted and if you had the fair opportunity to do so. That just means the action wasn't determined, right? At least it seems that way. That's a um, really reasonable understanding of this condition is that alternative possibilities, the ability to do otherwise, means that you, at that time of acting, had the ability to do something else. Okay, this is about your actions being up to you in a certain sense, not being determined or caused by your true self, but really being controlled or governed by you and having the power to do A and the power at the same time to do not A. All right. And then this is where this comes. Genuine alternative possibilities, or what people will describe as genuine alternative possibilities, those don't seem very compatible. They seem less compatible, at least, with determinism, because determinism says in order to get alternative possibilities, the past would have to be different. Because on determinism, the past and the laws of nature guarantee, you see, there's only one line here, not two, like we used to have in our other diagrams. On determinism, if you have an initial state of the world, some past, and the laws of nature, that means there's only ever one possible way the world can go. And in order to get a different possible future, a different possible action, we would have to just wonder what would happen if the past was different or the laws of nature were different, even. But if the past had been different, then you could have done something else. That's the only way to get alternative possibilities on determinism. You say, like, look, imagine this is the actual world. This is what actually happens. There's some beginning of the universe, and then lots and lots of time, millions of years. And then we get up to our history, and then, I'm born and I grow up and I become this person who's deciding what to do. Let's say I'm deciding whether to be, a carpenter or a philosophy instructor. And I decide, okay, I'm going to be a philosophy instructor. Boom. Then there I go, and I'm a philosophy instructor. And we asked, was that a free decision for me to be a philosophy instructor? Could I have chosen to be a carpenter? Well, if determinism is true, you might think, well, no, not given the past. If we're talking about this moment right here, could I choose something other than being a philosophy instructor? Could I have been a carpenter, right? Or a astronomer, right? Well, not with this past, because this past and the laws of nature, if they're deterministic, guarantee one possible future. They guarantee that I'll be a philosophy instructor. But someone might say, well, you could have been a carpenter if the past had been a little different. Oh, it just needs to be a little different, right? Maybe something in my childhood, I don't know, something I started making Lego chairs or something, and that made me really want to be a carpenter. Whatever it is, the past needs to be different, right? Because determinism means once you have a past and the laws of nature, you only get one possible future happening, and ever and ever. Whatever happens from here is also determined by all the stuff that comes before it. So if the past was different, then maybe I could have done something else and been a carpenter. And if the past was even different in another way, then maybe I would have been an astronomer, and so on and so forth for every single action. So the point here is, if you assume determinism is true, then the only way to get different possible actions, different possible outcomes, different possible choices is if the past was different. And if you remember from the Kane introduction book, um, this, what he calls the incompatibilist condition, the idea that indeterminism means that you get different alternative possibilities, but given the same past. So incompatibilists, people who want, like libertarians, who want there to be really genuine alternative possibilities, will say you need to be able to do otherwise given the same past. And determinism, as you can see, does not allow that because it only has one future. And so this condition here, free will is about the ability to do otherwise. Free acts must have genuine possible alternatives. It's about having a power to do A and the power to do not A at one time. So that seems less compatible with determinism. Now, there's debates about whether alternative possibilities are actually incompatible with determinism, but we don't need to get into those right now. But the idea here is just that Ekstrom says, look, let's appeal to Gary Watson, and Gary Watson had the right idea. Free will is about two things, fundamentally. It's about autonomy. It's about your actions being sort of self-determined, coming from your true self, right? Which is not yet about alternative possibilities, and so at least intuitively more compatible with determinism. And secondly, it's about having the ability to do otherwise. We want free actions to be actions that you could have avoided. If you couldn't have done anything else, doesn't really seem like it could be free. You at least have had had to have had the opportunity to do something else, and then that makes it possible that the action was free. Okay, so that's the way she understands free will. She's like, look, that's what free will is about. That, and then we could talk about what it takes for your action to be autonomous, what it takes for your action to have had alternative possibilities, right? To it to be undetermined. Okay, and then she does fill that out. Um, Now, what she does first, though, is now she's going to start saying why free will is not a mystery. Okay, so that's her main goal, is to say free will is not a mystery. Contrary to what Peter Van Inwagen says, we can actually make sense of free will. And in both ways, right? We can make sense of libertarian free will. She does not talk about this. She's not an agent causal power person. She's an event causal person. But she says, look, we can make sense of what free will is, how it happens, right? And we don't, and she thinks it's a good thing that we don't have to talk about this. So we can get rid of the mystery of agent causal power and make sense of how free will, of how free actions happen. But also, she thinks we can get out of Peter Van Inwagen's Mysterianism puzzle here, and she ends up addressing this part, as we'll see below. But first, before she does that, she says, look, here's a first reason. Here's an initial reason why free will is not a mystery, because of this stuff. Because of how we should understand free will. And here's how this sort of argument works. This little argument she gives. She says, this dual component, this is just what I'm calling it, the dual component understanding of free will, the one outlined above, that free will is about both autonomy and alternative possibilities. Everyone thinks that. Everyone in the free will literature, anyways. It's basically universal. I mean, this is basically how everyone who's arguing with each other compatibilists a lot of the time, not all the time, but a lot of compatibilists even um, use this, even though they're arguing with each other, they use this conception of free will where it's like, look, free will is about autonomy and it's about the ability to do otherwise, your action being up to you in this way. And if everyone's sort of theorizing and writing about free will, even though they argue about the details, about how to fill in the details of what autonomy means and what it means for an action to be up to you and what it means for you to be able to do otherwise, people argue about this stuff, about what those things mean. But it seems like, she says, they don't really argue about understanding free will that way. They don't really argue that, these things aren't really a part of free will, at least not most of the time. So she says, look, if everyone's understanding free will in this way, and then they just argue about the details, right? Well, then that means it's not really mysterious what free will is. If everyone thinks free will is about self-governed action combined with the ability to do otherwise, then everyone has the same basic understanding of free will, and then we just argue about the details, right? Therefore, she says, it's free will is not mysterious because we all have this similar basic understanding of what the fundamental components of it are, right? So there's not a mystery in really understanding kind of, at least fundamentally, what free will is. And she's like, well, maybe somebody will say, hey, maybe free will is still mysterious. You're talking about free action, right? Actions need to be self-determined, caused by the person in the right way. Excuse me, sorry. Free will, free actions need to be self-determined, but free actions also have to have alternatives. It has to be available possibilities. But there's this other thing, free will. That's mysterious. Free action, okay, that's what you're talking about above, but what is free will that causes free actions? And she says, okay, well, let's try to see what free will, what is this person who's raising this objection, this hypothetical person, what do they mean by free will? Well, she says one thing they might mean is just the capacity for free action. Well, then that's not really different. Then it's like the capacity for free action is just the capacity to autonomously determine your action, and the capacity to free action means that capacity allows different alternative possibilities. You have the capacity, the power, the ability to do A and to not do A. So if you just mean by free will the capacity for free action, then there's still no mystery because it's just what we talked about above. But then she says, well, someone might mean, well, free will is like, when we talk about the will, we're talking about trying to identify all the attitudes, the beliefs, the values, the commitments, the intentions that count as you, that count as your will. Right? Someone might say, okay, I get you just said what it means for an action to be free. It's got to be caused by you, the true self, and there has to be available alternatives. But what does it mean to, where are you? What about you? What about your mental states is like the real you, right? So maybe it's still a mystery how we identify the true self. Where's the will inside your head that's free? That's might be the mystery. And she says, well, if that's what you mean, if free will means the attitudes that count as you, and we're wondering what those are and how those can be free, she's like, well, it's still not mysterious because look, it might be debatable which attitudes count as you, right? Is it like any desire that you have, any impulse or any desire is you? And some people might say no, because you can have desires that you don't really want to have. So we can debate about what counts as you, right? And and some people might say no, it's about only desires that are um, rational or ideal desires or desires that you've reflectively thought about and formed, or maybe something else altogether, right? So we can debate about it. She's like, maybe it's contentious which attitudes count as you or your will or your true self. That's debatable, right? Which ones count? And also, maybe it's contentious or debatable whether alternative possibilities are even required. So compatibilists might say, I like the autonomy stuff here, that your action has to be determined by you, the true you. The, it has to be, your actions have to be caused by the mental states that are actually yours, but you don't need alternative possibilities. And so that might be debatable. Her her conclusion here is fine, it's contentious. Okay, maybe it's contentious what free will means because it's contentious which attitudes are yours, or it's contentious whether alternative possibilities are actually required. But that's not mysteriousness. Debatability, contentiousness is not the same as mysteriousness. If something's debatable, that doesn't mean that thing is mysterious. It just means that, you know, people disagree about the details. Okay, sorry. I'm having a little sore throat issue this past week, so apologies for that. Um, okay, now, so again, just recap here. She says there's this mystery about free will, but wait, let's understand what free will is, and we can appeal to Gary Watson's really helpful distinction here. Free will is about autonomy, and free will is about the ability to do otherwise. And also, hey everyone, basically everyone agrees about that, right? Even if they debate about whether free will really requires the ability to do otherwise, they understand. Even people who reject the ability to do otherwise, they're like, yeah, I mean, I get it. Like, I get why you would think that. I get that, like, an action being up to you feels like you might have to have this power to do two things at once. You know, not two things at once, but at one time have the power to do A and to not do A. And that seems a little bit like determinism would rule that out. But even if they say, like, look, let me tell you why you don't need that power, you can have this sort of conditional analysis, this counterfactual power to do otherwise. They're still understanding that free will is about this sort of ability to do otherwise, right? So um, she says that's a reason to think that it's not very mysterious because everyone kind of agrees on the fundamental components. And then she handles this sort of little objection about, maybe free action's different from free will. And she's like, not really. Probably not really. It's different. And even if it is a little different, that doesn't mean it's mysterious. It just means that people debate about the details. So she's trying to give us sort of initial uh, deflation of the mysteriousness idea. Okay. And then she's going to address each of these components, the autonomy component, right? And then the alternative possibilities component. And she's going to give her account of free will, what it means for an action to be autonomous, and what it means for an action to have had alternative possibilities, for there to be alternatives. Okay. And by filling out the account, by saying what the autonomy component comes to, and by saying what the alternative possibilities component comes to, is just her way of saying, look, this is not mysterious. If free will is about autonomy and alternative possibilities, and everybody kind of agrees on that, that's already a start towards it not being mysterious, because everyone kind of gets the idea of free will. But then we can start filling in the components. And she says, I'll fill in the components in a way that I think that you'll understand, and she hopes that you'll agree with. And if she can do that, that means that free will is even less mysterious, right? We're starting to understand what it means for an action to be autonomous and what it means for someone to have the ability to do otherwise in performing autonomous actions, right? Okay, so what does she mean by autonomy? What does it mean for Ekstrom to say that an action was autonomously performed or self-determined? Well, she says, first, let me do away with some existing accounts of autonomous action that she thinks are insufficient, they're problematic. Okay, so you might think, well, like the Hume and some of these older what we saw a few weeks ago, or maybe more than that, 5 weeks ago or so, as the classical compatibilists. The classical compatibilists who use this kind of model in this picture here and say, well, look, S does A, and then we ask, did S do A freely? Well, could S have done something other than A? Could this person have done another action? Well, if the past had been different, if they had wanted to do something different, or if they had chosen something different, then they would have done something different. And then that's enough to say S could have done otherwise, because if S had chosen differently, then S would have acted differently. S can't choose differently here because it's determined. But if the past had been different, then maybe S would have had different desires and so on, and then would have chosen differently and then would have done something differently. So this if part, this conditional analysis, allows someone to say, look, acting on your desires in the absence of constraints, like nobody's holding you down and forcing you or whatever, um, maybe that's a way in which you're autonomous. Is just you just do what you want, right? You just act on your desires. If you have a desire and that causes you to act, and nobody was constraining you, then that's enough. And Ekstrom says, no, that doesn't work. So this acting on your desires account of autonomy, that's not enough, she thinks. Why? Well, sometimes your desires and motivations don't really reflect your true self. So you can have a desire for something, and then that desire can cause you to act accordingly, right? I can desire to drink a bunch of alcohol, and then that desire, because it's strong enough, and maybe because I am not really thinking about other reasons or the consequences, and then so the desire just is effective, and it makes me get up and act and go drink a bunch of alcohol. We might ask, did you do that freely? Well, if what you mean, or I should say, did you do that autonomously, right? Was that self-governed? And if by self-governed you just mean, well, you do what you want, you act on your desires, then it would be free. But she says, well, that's not always the case. Sometimes you act on your desires and motivations, but not in a way that reflects your true self. Not in a way that would be self-governed or autonomous. And think about an impulse or people with an addiction who have these desires that seem kind of, and here we go, alien to us, right? Sometimes we're fighting against our own desires. So this is the idea that the Ekstrom's objections here is the idea that not all of your desires are really your true self. They're not really reflective of your true self. And cases, this is very common for philosophers to do, philosophers who are thinking about action and free will and so on. They use things like addiction, kleptomania, and other things like psychopathy and so on, uh, to show they think these kinds of conditions show that not all of our impulses or motivations or desires are really reflective of our true self. So an addict can do what they want, they can act on their actual desires that they have, but that not be autonomous. And it's because they don't want to have those desires. There's something going wrong with their ability for self-control, right? Usually we can kind of control our desires and we can modify them if we want. If someone's not an addict and they realize like, gosh, I've had these desires to just sit home and watch TV all day, and usually I'm pretty good about working out, you might think like, okay, if nothing's like sort of really wrong with my deliberative and self-control mechanisms, then I can think about that and decide, look, I need to get back to it. So I, maybe make a plan for myself, or I call a friend and say like, hey, can you work out with me for the rest of the week every day? And that will like help me do it, right? Like I'm having some self-motivation problems right now, but you are still able to exercise self-control by setting up your environment or modifying your behaviors so that you get rid of those desires to sit down and watch TV all day, or at least you can fight against them successfully, right? But and addicts, have a problem doing that. Maybe they can't do that. The idea here, though, the point of that is, um, are acting on our desires is not always doing what is in alignment with our true self. Okay, so just acting on your desires is not enough for autonomy, and certainly not enough for free will. Okay, and also, as we saw with manipulation cases, like from Paraboom, you can have your desires manipulated by a neuroscientist, right? A neuroscientist can implant, in a sense, desires in you, or there might be some other sort of deviant causation, brainwashing or whatever else. And if that's true, then um, acting on a desire that was manipulated into you by a neuroscientist would be autonomous. But that doesn't seem right. And so we need to add more to this. It can't just be that you have a desire and then you act on it. That's not enough. Okay. All right. Well, what about acting on a desire that you reflectively endorse? So you have it, oftentimes this gets talked about in terms of second order desires. So a first order desire is just a desire for something, like a desire for ice cream, or a desire to go to the gym, or a desire to go to Disneyland, or whatever. That's a first order desire. A second order desire is a desire for a desire. So think about it like this. Not only do I want to go to Disneyland, but I want to go to Disneyland. I want to have that desire. I like that desire. Now, think about the addict again. He's like, oh, I want alcohol, or I want heroin, or I want to do, cocaine, or whatever it is. There's this question of whether they really want those desires. And a lot of times in discussing addiction, you hear addicts themselves a lot of the time, and then people theorizing about addiction say, well, it's not enough that you just want, it's not the end of the story, I should say, that you just want to do these things, to take drugs or whatever. The question is, do you endorse those desires? And a lot of times addicts, part of their condition is that they have desires that they don't endorse, that they don't want. They're like, man, I really don't want to do drugs. I have this urge, this motivation, this desire to do drugs, and I'm trying to resolve that. I'm trying to fix that, or at least I don't want it, at the very least, right? Like, I wish I could fight this. I wish I could get over it, but the urge is just too strong, and I don't know how to get rid of it. But they want to get rid of it, right? They have a desire that they don't endorse or want, right? So this version is supposed to be a little bit more robust. It's supposed to be a step up from this version. And this was kind of this one down here is kind of the Harry Frankfurt version of autonomy, where it's not just about doing what you want, it's about doing what you want when what you want has been sort of endorsed by you. It's not just acting on your desires, it's acting on desires that you have endorsed. Okay, so you get a little bit of extra endorsement, and that's supposed to then get you autonomy. But Ekstrom says this is also not enough. This is also not enough because it just pushes the question back, right? So if we say like, okay, acting on your desires, that's enough for autonomy. Like, well, wait, not all your desires, right? Like, did you want that desire? Did that desire come from manipulation? Is that like really truly your desire? And it's like, well, okay, what if you endorse that desire? Then it's autonomous. Well, you might just say, was your endorsement of that desire autonomous? Did you endorse the desire, or were you like manipulated? You might endorse something because you were manipulated to endorse it, right? Um, and then you get an infinite regress with this question here. If you say like, well, did you endorse the desire? It's like, well, all right, but maybe you have to endorse the endorsement of your desire. Right. Well, then now we got an infinite regress. Then you're going to have to endorse the endorsement of your endorsement and endorse the endorsement of the endorsement of your endorsement. So you keep going back, and the question is just like, where do you stop this? It seems arbitrary to stop it at some point. And so she doesn't think it really helps to say, oh, well, all you need is not just a desire to do X, but you need a desire to do X that you also desire that you have. You have a second order desire to have that desire for X and for that desire to be effective in your action. And she says that's better, I think, but still not enough because we still push the question back. There's an infinite regress and arbitrariness worry because it's arbitrary where we stop the regress and say, no, one endorsement's enough. Or how about just two endorsements? That's enough. It just seems arbitrary. But then also she doesn't really talk about this, but there's still manipulation worries with the Frankfurt structural view. And we saw that with Paraboom, where you can get a neuroscientist to kind of manipulate your desires in a way that they're in line. They're in line with what your belief system is so that you endorse them, but they're manipulated. And manipulation is a worry. So what does she do? What does Laura Ekstrom do? Well, she says, let me add just a little bit more. So her view is going to look a little bit like this reflective endorsement of what you want and what your desires are. But she's going to add a little bit to it. It's going to be a little bit more robust than that. So she says, here's what I think autonomy comes to. Here's what self-determination is. Autonomous, self-determined actions are caused by what she calls preferences. They're caused by a certain kind of desire, not simply any desire. Okay, a preference is not just another name for a desire. It's a type of desire. We'll talk about that, right? But it's a special kind of desire. So an autonomous action is one that caused by what she calls preferences, and the preference has to be coherent. So let's talk about what that means. What are preferences? Well, a preference is a desire that has been formed. So a desire you didn't have before, and then it's formed, or it's a desire that you had, but it's been vetted or kind of maintained or evaluated by this process of critical analysis or critical evaluation. Okay. So it's not just any desire. It's a desire that has been either caused, or formed, or maintained, vetted through this process of critical evaluation. And this process is governed, caused, or initiated by, and well, governed really, because it's a process, not just initiated, but maintained and governed by your rational or cognitive faculties, by your ability to reason. Right? Your reasoning abilities govern or control your desires, your what are sometimes called, you'll recognize this word from the chapter, your conative abilities. So when she says, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but she says something about, I think she calls preferences a special kind of conative state. Conative states, Conative, are motivational states, states like desires that um, sort of they're not just merely representing the world like a belief, like I believe it's raining. That's like representing the world in a certain way. They are saying they're like representing the world as it kind of should be or as you want it to be. So I say like I wish it was raining or I want it to be raining right now. That's not me representing how the world is. That's me representing how the world should be or how I want the world to be. And those kinds of mental states, a lot of people think, are what motivate you, what push you around. Right? These motivational states like desires are the ones that cause actions that push you around and um, make like literally sort of make you move, right? Um, and so those kinds of processes, desires, our motivational process, she thinks is governed, at least sometimes, by our rational or cognitive faculties. So when we deliberate, we have lots of desires, and these are not always generated by ourselves, right? We just maybe see a billboard, and then we're like, I want some coffee now because I saw a Starbucks billboard. So you have desires that can kind of come up, sort of caused not by you, caused by your environment or randomly or whatever else. And that's sort of why just merely acting on your desires is not going to be enough. We want this kind of governance by our rational faculties. Okay. And she also says the not only does our rational capacity, our capacity for reasoning, not only does that govern the desires and evaluate them, but it does so by using our own conception of the good and the right. We use our values, our understanding of what is right and wrong, what is good and bad, and we use that in conjunction with our rational faculties, our reasoning ability. So our reason ability sort of like looks inside to our own conception of the good, and it looks inside to what desires we have, and then it evaluates them. Is this a good desire I have? Should I go get coffee? I mean, man, all I did was see a billboard. Am I being duped by Starbucks? Is it worth it to go get a coffee? Can I afford it right now? Should I spend that $5? Should I spend it somewhere else? Should I give it to charity? Do I need coffee? Have I already had coffee? All this, like, this is like a really simple decision of just getting coffee, but this happens, right? We have a desire and we evaluate it and whether we should act on it. And even if we're not thinking about acting, we're like, I really want to, go to Europe next fall, right? Long ways away. I'm not going to be doing any acting on that anytime soon, but we might think like, is that it? Or even more grandiose, right? Like, man, I want to be a better husband or father or son or um, friend or whatever else, right? Like these kinds of desires are the are excuse me, having desires like that is subject to our rational reasoning abilities and whether or not we think those are good desires. I mean, this is just kind of how we form the desires that we really want to have so that we can act in a way that's in accordance with our conception of what is good and how we should be acting. Okay, so this whole sort of system here that she's talking about is our desires being governed by rational faculties using our conception of the good. And then what happens after that process of critical evaluation, however long it is, we output some judgment, some rational judgment based in reason after consideration of all the evidence of whether or not that desire is worthy of keeping or maintaining it or even having if we don't have it in the first place. We're wondering whether we really want something. Right? Is that desire worthwhile? Is it valuable? Should I keep it? Should I change it a little bit? This kind of judgment is the output of this process of our values, of our desires being evaluated in light of our values by our rational faculties. Okay. And then, if a desire sort of survives this process, or if a desire is generated by this process, that's a positive judgment. Yes, I should have this desire. Yes, I still like this desire and I will keep it. That desire is called a preference. She just calls desires that are the output of this process preferences. That's what a preference is on her view. So this is a good point I think for me to say like this is just sort of what happens in sort of philosophizing, doing philosophy and this kind of conceptual um, it's not strictly conceptual analysis, but this idea of like, look, here's a term. She says autonomous actions are those caused by preferences, and you might think like, oh, well, preference is just a desire. Well, she's trying to say, no, it's not just a desire. It's a special kind of desire. And if you don't like the term preference, then pick another term. It doesn't matter what we call it. This is what matters. This stuff in here. What she's talking about in the world. Okay, it's these motivational states that have gone through this process of being governed by our rational faculties in light of our value system, and then we output some judgment about that desire, about that motivational state, and whether it's worthy of being kept or being formed in the first place. And when a desire survives this process and gets a positive judgment, yes, I will have this desire, yes, I like this desire, yes, I endorse this desire, then she just gives that the name preference. You can call it desire that survives the rational, critical, evaluative process. It doesn't matter what we call it, right? So just keep that in mind. This is when she says it's a desire or an autonomous action is caused by a preference. Just know that the word preference is not what's important. What's important is the thing that is she's referring to with that word. Okay. All right. So preferences cause, sorry, autonomous actions are those caused by preferences, but they are also have to be coherent. Well, what does she mean by that? Well, basically what she means is we've it's always pretty much always going to be the case for when we look at some person and ask whether they're acting freely that they have a bunch of preferences and they have a bunch of desires that maybe they haven't evaluated yet and they have a bunch of beliefs, right? They have a bunch of stuff within their rational or cognitive system, these beliefs about the world, and they have values, conceptions of the good, beliefs about the good. They have a whole sort of mental makeup, right? A whole psychological makeup, right? So it's not like one preference in isolation, right? We have a whole psychological makeup. And the question is not just whether the action was caused by a preference, or not just whether you have a preference, a desire that you endorse, roughly. It's about, um, whoops. Oh, here we go. Sorry, coherence. It's about that preference being consistent with your whole psychological makeup. Okay, so the autonomy problem that she solved, well, like, how do we make sense of autonomy? Well, just acting on your desires doesn't do it. Acting on desires that you desire that you have doesn't do it. We need a little bit more robust account of what this means. And she tries to fill that out a little bit more in detail. And she's like, well, how's this supposed to solve the problem? Well, governance of your desires by your reason, right? Your desires, she still thinks it's desires causing actions. That's still the basic model, right? But what kind of desire? Well, a desire that's governed by reason and your convictions, your conception of the good, your values, that brings in the self. That's just what it is for an action to be caused by you, because you just sort of are this capacity for um, rational reflection, reasoning, your deep convictions about what the good is. She says that capacity to perform this process of reasoning using your conception of the good, that is at least partly you. So this governance of desires by this process brings in the self because you just are, at least partly, identified with that capacity. And therefore, the operation of that capacity for critical reflection using your conception of the good is necessarily, it's like by definition, your own operation. It's your own governance. It's governance by you. So when that capacity to govern your reasons and critically evaluate them, when that capacity operates, that is just self-operation, because that capacity is just part of what you are. Okay? So that's part of how she brings in the self, because she thinks that this process, this capacity here that she's identified, is just literally partly identified with you. Okay. Now, also, it has to cohere the preference that gets shot out of this process and eventually causes you to act. It has to cohere with your other preferences. Okay. It has to, and your other convictions and so on, right? And that is when it does that, when it is coherent, your preference is coherent with your whole sort of belief desire system, belief preference system, I should say. That's just evidence that it's reflective of your true self, and it wasn't just sort of randomly generated by accident, right? So negative coherence, there's two kinds of coherence that she talks about. Negative coherence means that the preference doesn't sort of contradict another preference, like straightforwardly. You don't have a preference that comes out, it's like, I desire to do A, and then you comes out of your reflective process and you're like, okay, yeah, I do really like A. A's in line with what I think is good, and it's in line with my values and everything. And so, okay, good. That's a good value. Comes out, it survives the reflective process. But then you perform another reflective process, maybe a day later or whatever, and you get another preference, which is I I want to do not A. Well, that's a straightforward contradiction. And so it wouldn't, at least on its face, be a coherent set of preferences. Those two preferences would not be coherent. Um, and that's just a sort of simplified example, but there's different ways in which your preferences might conflict, right? You might say, I want to do A, and you don't have another preference that's like, I want to not do A, but you might have something that's like, I want to do B, or I want to do C, and then there's like entailments from these things. Well, C requires D, and D requires F, and F sort of presupposes G, and then G presupposes not to do A. It might be this chain of reasoning. So the point is to cohere with your set of preferences and beliefs and your whole sort of psychological makeup. We want to have both a lack of contradictions, but also we want your preferences to be defensible by that system, to just be sort of in line. They all want to point towards the same kinds of values and actions and so on. So you think of this sort of web of beliefs and values that you have and convictions. You have all kinds of desires, beliefs, values, and so that you're obviously you can't think about all at once. I mean, there's just so many um, mental states that you have. If we're talking about values, beliefs, convictions, preferences, right? You just have a whole complex psychological makeup. And so not only do we want to try to have as little contradiction in those mental states as we can, but we also want the preferences that you form, these desires that are vetted by your rational capacities, to be able to be justified by your whole web of beliefs. Okay. Why do you prefer A? Well, we'll look at my system of beliefs and values and so on, and it makes sense. It makes sense. This preference makes sense in light of my whole sort of web of beliefs and values and desires and so on. It makes sense. So not just is there not any sort of straightforward contradiction, but my web of beliefs makes sense of this preference. Okay. So that kind of coherence is also required for her account of what autonomy is. Okay. So autonomous actions are those that are caused by a preference, which is a desire that survives this process, and where that preference is also has to be coherent. It has to cohere with your whole set of attitudes, because otherwise you'd be kind of acting arbitrarily, randomly, not making any real sense. Okay. All right. So this is supposed to avoid the worries raised here. So she says, look, I don't like this account. I don't like this account, which is a little better and getting closer to the account that she likes, but she doesn't like them because of these problems, right? Sometimes our desires don't reflect our true self, so we can't just act on any desire, right? You can be manipulated into having certain desires. This doesn't do enough. It pushes the question back. Well, why did you endorse the desire? Was that free? Was that autonomous? Right, you get this regress worry and again manipulation. So she's supposed to avoid these worries, obviously, because she thinks her account is better. And the question is, does she? Does she? She just says at one point, oh, also, by the way, guys, your preference that causes your action, right? And again, remember, preference is not the same as desire. Preference is a desire that has survived your rational evaluation of it. Okay. So not only does your action have to be caused by a preference, and not only does that preference have to be coherent, but the preference can't be manipulated. She basically just says that. It's like, okay, an autonomous action is one that's non-deviantly caused by your preference. And the preference itself has to be formulated in a way that's not deviant or manipulated. So basically, she says autonomous actions are caused by preferences that are coherent and, in parentheses, by the way, hey, no manipulation allowed. That's what she says. So does that really avoid the manipulation worry? Does it really avoid? She just says, oh, no manipulation, by the way, guys, no brainwashing. Well, if you don't want any deviant causation, I mean, I guess you can just say no manipulation. Nope, that doesn't count. But you need to tell us why that doesn't count. If we satisfy all your conditions and we can we can get an action being caused by a preference that's coherent with your whole system, that's what you just said was autonomous. But now we can get that by putting a manipulator in there. And you just say, well, no, manipulators don't count. Like, well, why not? You need to say why. What is it doing? What is it taking away from the account that you gave? And moreover, manipulators, brainwashers, we can do other kinds of deviant causation. What about lightning strikes? What about random lightning strikes that make it so that you have a preference that happens to align with your web of beliefs, and because of the lightning strike, it caused your rational faculties to decide to make a certain judgment about that preference, namely to keep it, and then that preference causes you. And if the lightning strike wouldn't have happened, then you would have got rid of that preference. Right? This should sound kind of like the manipulation argument from Pair Boom that we talked about. The question here is really, does she really avoid the manipulation, deviant causation worry? Excuse me. It's not clear that she does. She just stipulates that you can't be manipulated, and that's kind of ad hoc. It's not clear what the evidence or the justification for that is, other than avoiding the problem. And we need some independent reasons. Also, um, we why don't we get a regress here? So we get a regress here. It's like, okay, it's not just acting on your desires that makes your action autonomous. It's acting on a desire that you want to have, that you endorse. And she's like, no, this just pushes the question back. Was your endorsement autonomous or free? And when do you stop the endorsement of the endorsement? Well, why can't we just do the same here? Was this process governed by rational faculties autonomous? Well, she says, well, you just are that process. Okay, why should we think that? Why should we think we're that process and not our desires? Why are these mental states really nice and identified with us and not these other mental states? What's the principled reason for that? Right? And does the rational process, exercising your rational faculties, what's the cause of that? Does it just happen? I mean, that's caused by things before it, right? And it's caused by things that interact with it, influences, things that you see in the environment, other kinds of dispositions that you have. And then how was all this stuff formed? Did you make your own rational faculties to be sensitive to reasons in the way that they are? People's rational faculties, the way that they see reasons and what they take to be a reason or not a reason for acting, and their values, the conceptions of the good, this differs from person to person. When you look at someone acting or reasoning and you say, "Oh, they're not being very rational." Well, that's according to what you take to be good reasons. Now, I'm not trying to say there's like some subjectivism or relativism here. All I'm saying is our rational faculties differ in the way that they operate. And that will change, and our conception of the good differs. And so the interaction of the two obviously will differ. And so the output, the judgment of which desires become preferences, depends on how these are and how they operate and interact, right? So, is how your rational capacity was formed and operates and what it's sensitive to, was that autonomously formed by you? Obviously, not before you had a rational capacity, because on her view, rational capacities are required for autonomy. What about before you had rational capacities? How were those capacities formed? They couldn't have been formed autonomously, on her view. So does autonomy just like appear at some point? And how is that? Who are you if your rational capacities, as she says, are partly identified as you? Where are you before your rational capacities exist? Like as a 2-year old or something. And she might say, well, you have like minimal or rudimentary rational capacities, right? Do you have like rudimentary or minimal autonomy when you're 2? Doesn't seem like it. I mean, how about when you're 6 months old? Doesn't seem like it. So where do we get autonomy? Where does it come in? Right? And this kind of comes back to this too. This She says, well, it can't just be caused by your rational faculties, the preference. The preference also has to be coherent. It has to cohere with like your whole set of beliefs and everything. And if it does that, if it's coherent, if your preference can be made sense of by your web of beliefs, well, then that's a good thing too. Then that's evidence that it's like represents your true self. Well, coherence views have this problem of sneaking in the thing that they're trying to justify. So if you want to say like, well, this preference is representative of your true self, it really represents who you really are, because it's coherent, meaning it's justified by your whole web of beliefs. Well, where is you in that whole web of beliefs? Because it had to start somewhere, right? There's no, I mean, these kind of go hand in hand. There's no autonomy or self-determination to begin with when you get your first belief or your first set of beliefs, right? When your web of beliefs, your web of mental attitudes starts getting formed initially, when you're very, 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 very young, there's no autonomy going on there. You don't pay, you just start forming, psychological states, right? But then all of a sudden, if what's supposed to make something a part of you, a part of your true self, is to be sort of coherent, to mesh with that web of attitudes, where does the self come in? Where does autonomy or the self come in? It wasn't there before, but all of a sudden, just having a web of beliefs that's coherent is all of a sudden you. It's just weird how this comes in. That's a worry someone might have. And then on this view, on the view that she's given us, it seems like we have to think that whenever someone acts out of character or whenever someone acts irrationally, like according to their own belief system, they're like, I really want to do this thing and I have a lot of reason to do that thing. And then all of a sudden, kind of spontaneously, and maybe even for no real reason at all other than that they just want to, somebody does something else that looks, according to what their beliefs are, kind of irrational, right? Or out of character. Is that really not autonomous? By definition, that's not autonomous. There's no like possible way in which we can make sense of somebody performing a free autonomous action that is just random and for no reason at all, and maybe even irrational. Irrational in the sense of not cohering with a lot of their other um, sort of fundamental beliefs. Maybe, but that's a question, right? It seems odd. I mean, this may be a little bit of an unfair way to say it or to characterize the objection, but the idea is that she needs to tell us why it's unfair. But here's the idea. On her account, in order to act autonomously, act according to sort of your true self, which is required for free will, right? Um, your action has to be caused by a preference that was like kind of robustly vetted by your rational faculties and comes out of that process and is coherent and meshes with your whole sort of psychological state. But that seems like you can't act impulsively or irrationally or out of character and still be autonomous or free. But is that really true? I mean, free and autonomous action can't be impulsive and sort of irrational. Maybe not, but the point is she needs to say more about that. That might be an objection. Okay, so in any case, that's her view of autonomy. It's just like, look, free will is not a mystery because everyone understands it as this dual component thing, autonomy plus the ability to do otherwise. And it's also not mysterious because we can make sense of autonomy in a way that's better than these other accounts that were out there, and in a way that sort of brings in the self. You are just this sort of rational entity who is able to consider a bunch of evidence, consider your own values and what you think is good, and evaluate your desires and pick which ones you like. And that's a more robust process than just desiring a desire. Right? It's like, I want alcohol and I want alcohol. you know, this is a more robust process that she's trying to say is like brings you in because you're this sort of rational creature, sort of like by definition. And so the rational faculty just kind of is you in a way. So she thinks we can make sense of this. At least she wants to say that's an account, that's a view of autonomy that I've given you. That's not mysterious. Maybe you think there's problems here that I need to address, but it's not mysterious. That's what she wants to say. Okay. So how does she fill in the alternative possibilities component? Not only does an action have to be autonomous, but it has to be something that you could not do, right? You have to have other possibilities. Well, she says alternative possibilities are not required at the moment of performing an action, right? It's not like when you do A, right? It you have to be able to not do A. She actually doesn't think that. She thinks the alternative possibilities come in somewhere else. So she does not say that at the moment of acting, you need an ability to do otherwise. She does not think that. That's okay if you do have the ability to do otherwise, but even if your action at the moment of acting is determined, that's still not a problem yet for her. when you decide to do A, you do have to have that action caused by a coherent preference. That's what we just talked about, right? When you decide to do A has to be caused by a coherent preference of yours, right? Preference coheres with your attitudes. It was formed and maintained by this process of evaluation. Like that all has to be true when you do A. That the coherent preference has to be the cause of you doing A. But you don't have to have the ability to do not A. Not yet. Where you do need the ability to do otherwise is when the preference is generated. So it's in the process of evaluating your desires and forming them or maintaining them. Just remember, this process of critical, reflective, rational evaluation, that process has to either cause you to have a preference that you didn't have before, or it can just maintain a preference. As you learn more things about yourself, as you get other desires, and you have to like sort of reevaluate your attitudes and what you want, then maybe you already have a preference and then you decide to maintain it. Sometimes you decide to get rid of a preference. So it can either cause you to have a preference or it can maintain a preference. But it's that process of critically evaluating your desires that has to be indeterministic. It cannot be deterministic. You can't form or maintain preferences through this rational process. You can't do that deterministically. Okay. It had to be possible for you to not form or maintain that preference. That is where the alternative possibilities has to come in. So even if you're determined to do A, remember from again like maybe 5 or 6 weeks ago now, the difference between global and local determinism. Okay? So you might be determined to do A, even if determinism isn't true globally. It might be that just the circumstances that you're in at that moment determine that you do A. She doesn't actually think that's a problem yet, even though she is an incompatibilist. She thinks where you need the ability to do otherwise is not at the moment of acting. All you need at the moment of acting is that your act was caused by a coherent preference of yours. Where you need the ability to do otherwise is when that preference that caused you to act was formed. Okay. Now, what kind of indeterminism? As I said above, event causal. She's not an agent causal person. She thinks agent causation is too mysterious. Okay. She's trying to get rid of mystery. So she appeals to, again, what is a lot of times thought of as just ordinary event causation. What happens in causation? One event causes another event, right? And it's indeterministic because one event didn't have to cause that event. It could have caused another event. So it causes, indeterministically causes, meaning it causes it with a certain probability. It's not determined. But the event, for instance, of deliberating over your reasons, this process, this rational process of critically evaluating, that event causes, indeterministically, causes the event of judging that a desire is worth keeping. And that makes the desire a preference. Or you might even just say judging that a preference is worthy of keeping. Maybe it's already a preference and you're critically evaluating whether you should maintain that preference. But the point is, her view of how causation works is event causation. Okay. One event, like deliberating and going through this rational process, indeterministically, meaning with a certain probability, causes another event that did not have to happen, it's not determined, of you forming a preference or maintaining a preference, which is just the same as judging that a certain desire is worth keeping or worth having. Okay. Making that judgment just is to perform a preference. This is up here, right? You have this process, you use your conception of the good, you evaluate your reasons, and you output a judgment of worth or value for that desire. Yes, I like that desire. Let's keep it. Let's act on it. Right? That judgment is just to form or maintain a preference. And that just is making a decision about who you want to be and the kinds of preferences that you want to have and the kinds of preferences that you want to be effective, that you want to actually act on. Okay. So that's why it's kind of you-y. It's a you sort of event. It's an event that expresses you. It's an event where you decide who you want to be, she says. And the way that it happens is through event causation that is undetermined, not determined, probabilistic. Okay, let's look at a sort of diagrammatic or pictorial representation of this kind of view. I know this is a little bit busy, this diagram, but let's try to walk through it. So we'll start from the right, actually. So you have a person who does some action. S does A, right? And we're wondering whether S does A freely. Does S perform this action A freely? Now, what are the two questions that we have to ask? Was it autonomous? And was there an alternative possibility? Because we need this action to be self-determined. We need it to be representative of or flow from the true self of S. So it needs to be autonomous. But it also can't be determined. It had to be possible that S did some other thing. Or there had to be some indeterminism, at least in the process that led to A. Okay, so we always start with an action, at least most of the time. We start with an action and we ask whether it was free. And then we decide, okay, what caused it? How did it come about? Was there alternatives or not? So her view is, in order for this to be free, this action, it has to be caused by a preference, a coherent preference. I left coherence out of this, by the way, out of this diagram. It was already a little bit too busy. So we'll just assume for the sake of argument that S's preference here is coherent with their whole sort of system of beliefs. Okay. So assume it's coherent. S does A. Is that free? Well, it was caused by their preference. I want to do A. So they're deliberating. They have this preference. I want to do A. And then, since it's a preference, what does that mean? Well, it means that it's a desire that they had beforehand that went through this process. It was an input into this process of critical evaluation. Do I want A? Is A a good thing? Well, let me take as an input my understanding of what the good is, right? So using the conception, your own conception of the good as an input into this rational process. This bubble here, the critical evaluation process, is a different color because it's supposed to represent that this is the rational faculties. This is sort of your rational faculties going through this process of taking your conception of the good and using that and using your reasoning about all the considerations, all the circumstances that you're in, and all your other beliefs over here that I didn't draw or represent. But using all of that, you sort of take this desire and you say, is that a good desire? Do I want to have this desire? Is there good reason to have this desire? Right? And this process has an output, indeterministically causes or maintains this preference. So the desire here survives this evaluation process. And that's what makes it a preference. Okay. And now what is the gray? That's the alternative possibilities. So not only does your action have to be caused by a preference, which is a desire that survived this evaluation process, right? You still have it, and then that thing causes you. That, so far, is just autonomy. So if we leave the gray out, all of this other stuff, evaluating your desire, and then it survives, and now you have it as a preference, and then that preference causes you to act, that, all this colored stuff, is autonomy. But once we get the ability to do otherwise here, so it has to be, basically what this means, indeterministically causes. And this doesn't say indeterministically here, right? Because she doesn't care if this is deterministic. She doesn't care if once you have a preference, that determines you to do A, if your preference is for A. She doesn't care about that. At least not for autonomy or free will. The preference that survives this process and then causes you to do A, that is all just autonomy. That just means A was determined by your true self because it went through this process where you evaluated it with your rational faculties. But now this, if the process of evaluating your desire and then making it into a preference, a vetted desire, if that output there, if that process results in the preference indeterministically, if it wasn't guaranteed, determined that you were going to have this preference as an output. In other words, it has to be possible that you had some different preference or no preference for A. Right? If that was possible, but obviously didn't happen in the actual world, it's possible that you went through this process and then gave up your preference for A. As long as that's possible, and then it didn't happen, so this got caused by the process, but it wasn't determined, then all of this is free will. That's a free action. So again, you have an action. The question is, was it autonomous? And all the colored stuff is autonomy. Your action was caused by a desire that survived this critical evaluation process, and a desire that survives this critical evaluation process is just called a preference. So it was caused by a preference that coheres with all of your other set of beliefs. And that process of going through this evaluation process and coming out as a preference, if that process was indeterministic, not determined, then this whole thing is free, is a free action. Okay, that's her view. Now, she says this account, the whole account, right? This account of alternatives, where the alternatives fit in, alternative possibility fits in here. But the whole account, alternative possibilities together with the autonomy account, provides a number of benefits, right? She says, look, this shows how we can be free in the sense that our actions are generated by us. They're self-determined. Why are they self-determined? Because it's our own rational faculties, which partly constitutes who we are. And this evaluation of what we take to be the good, that produces those desires. And so we get action that represents us, ourself, but in a way that wasn't determined. It allowed at some point for an alternative possibility. Okay. You could have went through this whole process exactly the same and then ended up without this preference for A. That was possible. Okay. But we don't have to assume that basically agent causal powers exist. We don't have to assume that some events occur without being caused, like the agent causal people do. They're mysterious, this mysterious agent power. We don't have to assume that. Everything's caused. There's no agent power that causes things without being caused. Everything's caused, and we like that if we're trying to be naturalist and scientific. And again, here, it's naturalist, right? There's no mysterious powers. There's no power that's not only not caused, but a power that's like independent of the physical laws of nature. We don't have to think that. Agent causal theorists, at least some of them, will say, look, I don't have to think that either. This is not being really fair to me. But even if they're right, there is a question there of like this mysteriousness of this power and how it's uncaused and whether that means it's outside of the laws of nature. She doesn't even have to worry about that. She doesn't even have to answer that question. It's just not a question for her because she has all of this event causation. No special agent powers, right? Just event causation, this event of deliberating and critically evaluating your desires and taking into account all the reasons in your account of the good. That process indeterministically causes this state event of having a certain preference and then thinking about it. And then that event of having this preference causes this other event of you acting in accordance with that preference. Just events causing events causing events. Normal stuff. No special powers. And she thinks that's good. That's a good thing. And it also accounts for the role of self-formation. Okay, this sort of thing here, forget acting on your desires for a second, but just going through this whole process and then coming out with certain preferences that cohere with your whole system and that were vetted by this really nice reasoning ability we have. That's just part of what it is to form who you are. You decide what kind of preferences you want. You think about them, you reflect on them with rational capacities. And that's a sort of self-formation. And her account seems to capture that. Okay, now the last sort of argument that she gives against the mystery of free will is directly supposed to address Peter Van Inwagen. So let me back up for just a second and say, here's kind of the review, right? There's this kind of mystery with Agent Powers and mystery because of Van Inwagen. She says, first of all, because of how we understand free will, this two component theory, free will is not a mystery because obviously everyone can understand the fundamental idea of free will because everyone has this dual component account, right? But also we can fill in the account in a way that makes sense. Autonomy is about desires that survive this rational process. Autonomy is about acting from desires that are governed by your own reasoning. And also, alternative possibilities means that your reasoning process that governs your desires just needs to be not deterministic, right? Determinism has to be false here. And we can make sense of all that. And look, it has some benefits. So that's where we've come. And then she says, let me more directly address Peter Van Inwagen. Okay. So here's a kind of a little bit more detailed view of the mystery of free will from Peter Van Inwagen. Here's his argument. First, these two are just the ones we saw above in this one, but we'll add a little bit here. So if our actions are determined, then we don't have free will. Why? Again, because of the consequence argument. Determinism makes it so that we can't do anything other than what we do. We don't have any control over what we do. It's all determined by the past and the laws of nature. If our actions are not determined, then we don't have free will. Why? Because it seems like a matter of luck. Then our actions just have certain probabilities of occurring, 50%, 80%, 20%, 99%. It doesn't matter because if we roll back the universe, we could have been exactly the same and done something else. And that means it seems like it's a matter of luck that we did what we did. Okay? Because in another world, we are exactly the same and we did something else. Okay. Now, the world, the actual world, is either determined or not determined. That's just logically exhaustive. That's just, those are the only two options. You could see not here is just the opposite. There's no like in between. It's either determined or it's not determined. It's either raining or it's not raining, right? I'm either 26 or I'm not 26. My this pen on my desk is either all blue or it's not all blue. Okay, same thing here. The world is one of these ways. It's not another way. There's not another way for it to be. This is not determined. It's just indeterministic, right? Well, if our actions are in a determined world are not free, and if our actions in an undetermined world or world that's not determined are not free, and the world has to be one of those, then we don't have free will. Okay, that's just if this is true, if this is true, and if this is true, then this follows logically. So this argument here is valid. It's a logically valid argument. The question is whether these are true. This one is obviously true because it's just logically exhaustive. And so the question is really whether these are true, right? So just because this argument up to this point is valid doesn't yet mean that it's a successful argument. It just means that the logic is valid. Now the question is, are these true? And here's the reason that Van Inwagen thinks that they're true. Because the consequence argument and the luck argument. That's why he thinks these are true. This and this. Whoops. This. Okay. So we don't have free will. That's the conclusion of the first, what would that be? 2/3 of the argument. Well, then he says, okay, we don't have free will, but hey, wait a minute, we do have free will. Why? Well, intuitively, we do. Just, close your fist, look at it, and open it when you feel like it. Seems like we can perform some free actions. It's at least intuitive. That's not conclusive evidence that we have free will. It's just really intuitive that we're free. Also, he thinks people are morally responsible. We won't get into his argument for that, but partly it's intuition. It's just like, look, people are blameworthy for stuff and praiseworthy probably for some stuff. But there's at least some people who are morally responsible, and you just can't be morally responsible without free will. So there's at least some strong initial evidence that we do have free will. And there's some strong initial evidence and it's only strong. It's not, logically conclusive. It's logically conclusive if we believe these are true. But we only believe these are true, at least these two up here, based on the evidence we have for them, right? So, which are strong evidence, maybe defeasible, but the point is, we have strong evidence to believe this, we have strong evidence to believe this. But as hopefully is clear, maybe I should make it a little bit more clear. These are opposites. We do have free will. We don't have free will. Those, as we just showed here in 3, those are opposites, and therefore they can't both be true. Right? One of these has to be false. Therefore, the fact that we have free will, this being true, is a mystery because this also seems true. And they can't both be true because that's logically inconsistent. So what's the mystery? Van Inwagen says, look, I'm just more confident in this than I am in this and this, so I'm not going to give this up. Right? Therefore, I need to give this up, and the only way to give this up is to think that one of these is false. But he's just like, look, what's the evidence for these? It's the consequence argument and the luck argument. And he says, I just can't see what's wrong with these arguments. These arguments look successful to me. They look like valid, sound arguments. And if I can't find out what's wrong with these, but I can't give this up, then I can't give this up either because I can't find out what's wrong with these. So what he says is, so to keep this, we have to reject 1 or 2. Can't reject this one. But he says, I have to reject them without any good reason because I can't see what's wrong with these arguments. Something must be wrong with those arguments, but I can't figure out what it is. Therefore, we do have free will, but it's a mystery how, because I have yet to find out what the problem with this argument is up to here. So throw our hands in the air and say, shit, I don't know what to do. Keep this. Don't say yet what's wrong with this because I don't know what it is, but just keep this and just say it's a mystery. That's Mysterianism. PVI says, Peter Van Inwagen says, if you ask me what's wrong with the luck argument in premise 2, because this is the one, before I say that, this is really the one that he thinks we should reject. He does not want to be a compatibilist. He wants to keep this as true. If our actions are determined, we don't have free will. He does not like compatibilism. So he's more confident in the consequence argument than he is in the luck argument, I would say. So this, if anything, this is the one he's going to want to give up. He thinks if there's something, if there's a place where we can get free will, it's in a world that's not determined. So this is going to be the problematic premise that we should give up. But again, he says, I just don't see what the problem is with the luck argument. I don't know how we can reject this. I don't know how we can reject this because I can't see what's wrong with the evidence for it. But if we're going to reject one, this is the one that he would want to reject because he's an incompatibilist. He's just having trouble figuring out how we can get free will in an indeterministic world, right? So it's like, if you ask me what's wrong with the luck argument in premise 2, I have to say that I am, as current American slang has it, absolutely clueless. Indeed, the problem seems to me evidently impossible of solution. There's no solution to the luck argument. That's what he's saying. But there has to be a solution to the luck argument if we're going to accept this. So it's a mystery. This is a kind of a cool, sort of interesting view that an argument that he raises. Okay, so let's go slow. Sorry. So notice here that you don't have to give up 2, like Van Inwagen wants to, and like Ekstrom wants to. They both are incompatibilists, so they want to get rid of this premise. But Van Inwagen thinks that we can't. He doesn't see what the problem is. And Ekstrom just is like, hey, Van Inwagen, let me help you out. I found a problem with the luck argument. I found a way around it. Okay, so they want to give that up, but that doesn't have to be the solution. You can give this up and you can be a compatibilist. You can reject the consequence argument and be a compatibilist. You can say, hey, we don't need the ability to do otherwise. Or we can say, well, let me give you a understanding of the ability to do otherwise that's compatible with determinism, right? So you can give this up and be a compatibilist. Say, no, we do have free will. This is false because this is false because compatibilism is true, right? That's one thing you could do. So compatibilists reject one. Non-Mysterian libertarians like Ekstrom are going to reject two. And skeptics also, Ekstrom points this out, skeptics can get out of this by saying, well, we don't have free will. Look, this is the argument for the skeptic. No free will on determinism, no free will on indeterminism, right? And therefore, what? If the world is determined or undetermined, what's the conclusion? If we don't have free will on either in either world, we don't have free will, right? And I believe Ekstrom says something about this, which I'm trying to quickly find in the paper. Uh, okay, here it is. Uh, One might attempt to undercut free will Mysterianism by presenting evidence against the final premise, which is this one, right? Against, that is, the claim that we undeniably do have free will. So Peter Van Inwagen thinks that this is undeniable, and he gives different evidence for it, but she says you can undercut this Mysterian argument by rejecting 5. Such alleged evidence might be empirical in nature, or the evidence might be rational. One might take the final premise of the argument for free will to be the weakest of those in support of a patently incoherent conclusion. The incoherent conclusion is this: we do when we don't have free will, thus free will is a mystery. She's like, look, there's just not strong enough evidence for 5, right? And on this ground, you might reject it. Okay, so why doesn't she take that route? Well, because almost nobody does, because that leads to skepticism, and people are just worried about skepticism. They don't really like it. Um, so the skeptic is going to say, this is not good evidence for this because all of these things and these things, they also undermine responsibility, not just free will. And so to say that someone's responsible is to just beg the question. It's like, well, why are people free? Well, because they're responsible. Well, what's the worry about free will? Well, this stuff and this stuff. Well, that's a worry for responsibility too. So, why do you just get to start with the fact that people are responsible, especially if you think that responsibility requires free will? It seems to maybe beg the question. So, some people say, I don't think we have enough evidence to hold on to this, especially if holding on to this creates a contradiction. So Van Inwagen is more confident in this than these, but someone might say, why are you so confident in this? You're just starting from the wrong position. Okay, so that's the question, right? Which is the weakest, 1, 2, or 5? And she thinks 2 is the weakest because she can get around the luck objection. That's what she thinks. Okay, so what's her solution to the luck objection? Remember, the luck objection is if the world is undetermined, if you have an action and it's undetermined, then that means those actions are up to chance. If you at one point you could do A or you can do B, and A and B you can't do both. You can either do A or you can do B, and the world is undetermined, that means there's some probability of A happening and there's some probability of B happening. And that probability is not 1, because 1 is determinism. That guarantees it's either 99-1 or 50-50 or whatever it is, but there's some probabilities. And if you're exactly the same, if the history of the world is exactly the same, if your circumstances are exactly the same, yet you can do one thing or another thing, if we just roll back the probability, or we roll back the universe over and over and over again, you're just going to sometimes do one and sometimes do the other, and they will trend towards certain probabilities. That seems like nothing explains why you did one rather than the other. It's just a matter of chance. It's just chance, luck, that you ended up in the I did A world versus the other possible I did B world. And if you end up in the I did B world, it just seems like chance because you could have exactly the way you were, you could have ended up in the I did A world. So it seems like chance. Okay. Now, she says this argument, for it to work, we need to know what chance means. When Peter Van Inwagen says indeterminism means that actions are simply a matter of chance. Also, if an act is simply a matter of chance, then the action cannot be free. Those are kind of the two main claims in the argument that invoke this idea of chance. Indeterminism, if determinism is false, then our actions are not determined, but undetermined actions are a matter of chance. They have probabilities or whatever. Um, Secondly, an action being a matter of chance is not a free action. So he has these two claims, and she says, okay, fine, I see your argument. What do you mean by chance? Should we think these are true claims? Are undetermined actions simply a matter of chance? And if they are, if actions are a matter of chance, that means they can't be free. Should we think those are true? Well, in order for the argument to work, they both have to be true. But in order to see whether they're true, we need to know what this means. Chance. And she's like, Van Inweg is not super clear about this. Well, I guess she didn't say that. But the idea is, it's not really clear what he means by chance. Or, even if she wants to not say that he's being unclear, but just say, there's different things we might mean by chance. Now, let's see if any of them can get us both of these being true. If there's an understanding of chance that makes both of these true, then the argument works. Peter Van Inwagen's argument works. But if we understand chance, if we have a definition of chance that makes either one of these false, it doesn't even have to be both, just one of them has to be false, then the Mysterian argument doesn't work. And she wins. Well, so let me rephrase that. Then the luck argument doesn't work. Okay, which means she can reject this premise, and then the Mysterian argument doesn't work. Because this premise, if our actions are not determined, then we don't have free will, rests on the luck argument. That's the evidence for it. And if you can reject the evidence, then you can reject the premise. And if you reject this premise, you can reject this conclusion. And that's what you want to do to keep this one. Okay, so that's what she's doing. She's attacking the luck argument. She's attacking the luck argument, okay, in order to attack premise 2 so that she can keep this and reject this. We don't have free will. This conclusion 4 comes from 1 through 3. Comes from these together. So we need to get rid of one of these in order to get rid of 4. Can't get rid of this one because that's just logic. She doesn't want to get rid of that one because to get rid of this one means you like compatibilism, and she doesn't like compatibilism. She wants to be an incompatibilist, a libertarian. So she needs to get rid of this premise. And to do that, she needs to get rid of the luck argument or solve the luck argument. So that's what she's doing, okay? Now, again, repeat this. The way to get rid of the luck argument is to reject one of the claims, one of the premises, same thing. And the premises invoke this idea of chance. Undetermined actions are chancy. Chancy actions aren't free. She's like, what do you mean by chance? Let's see. If you mean, she gives 3 possible versions of chance definitions, and she says, none of them make both of these true. So if we spell out what we mean by chance, one of those is going to be false. And if one of those is false, the luck argument fails, and therefore the Mysterian argument fails. All right. Chance, she says, maybe you think chance means it's a real sort of power. So when you say undetermined actions are a matter of chance, you might mean there's this thing, this entity, this power, this force called chance, and that determines which of the different possible outcomes will occur. Remember, undetermined, meaning there's at least two possibilities. Remember our old diagrams of the line going with a history and then it splits into either A or B, right? What what determines whether you do A or B? And Van Inwagen says, well, it's just a matter of chance. She's like, well, do you mean there's like this power in the universe? This force? Not of the agent, but just this like force in the universe that's called chance that determines which outcome occurs. And she says, if you think that, then this is false. Undetermined actions are a matter of chance. She's like, you don't have to think that. If you think indeterminism is true, if you think some actions are not determined, that doesn't mean you have to believe in this mysterious force called chance that like brings about one of the outcomes. That's really weird. That I don't know what the evidence, she says, I don't know what the evidence would be for that. Why, if you think determinism is false, why would you have to think that there's this like force, chance, that sort of brings about states of affairs as opposed to just events bringing about other events, right? So if you mean some real weird power called chance that determines the outcome, she says, I think we can reject this because being an indeterminist, denying determinism, undetermined, thinking actions are undetermined doesn't mean you have to think that there's this weird power. Okay. Or she says, maybe you think, let me switch these. I'm going to reverse this order. Sorry. She does, I had them in her order, but let me switch that. So another understanding of chance that she considers is maybe chance means that an act is purposeless. To say undetermined actions are a matter of chance means undetermined actions are purposeless or unplanned or arbitrary, right? Unintentional. Well, she says that's not true. It's not true that undetermined actions are simply not purposeful, purposeless, right? It doesn't mean that they have to be unplanned or lacking intention. Nothing about indeterminism, nothing about the fact that you could do one thing or another thing means that those actions are unintentional. They can still be caused by your intentions. Okay, it doesn't mean that those actions have to be independent of your reasons or deliberation, right? Compatibilists who think that determinism is true or can be true, people who think that free will can be possible even if determinism is true, they don't lose um, um, purpose, right? Intention, reasons. And so, what does that mean? That means that even if the world is determined, then your actions can be caused by your reasons and your intentions. Well, why would that be different on indeterminism? Just because just because your choice can cause different actions doesn't mean that now your intentions and your reasons and so on and your deliberation doesn't cause your action. It just causes it indeterministically. So your intentions, your reasons and stuff, they don't have to be independent of your actions just because indeterminism is true. They can still play a causal role. Right? So chance doesn't have to mean weird power out there in the universe. It doesn't have to mean that your actions are purposeless, right? So we can reject this on both of these understandings of chance. And finally, she says, maybe chance just means probability. Okay, maybe what he means, Van Inwagen, when he says this, is undetermined actions are simply probabilistic. Undetermined actions are simply governed by probabilities. Probabilities less than 1. Remember, a probability of 1 is determined, guaranteed. 1 is the maximum for probabilities. Probability of 1 or less than 1 and greater than 0, right? Maybe that's what he means. Undetermined actions are governed by probabilities, less than 1, greater than 0. Sorry, just make that real clear. All right. And this, she says, ends up making this false. Why? Remember radioactive decay. Even if you think that the world is indeterministic, undetermined actions, you don't have to think that they're governed by probabilities. You can still think that some actions, at least, are what we might call purely undetermined, meaning they're not determined, they don't have probability of 1, and they're not determined not to happen, they don't have probability of 0, but they also don't have any probability in between. They have no probability at all. This is like the radioactive decay that doesn't have any set probabilities for when it will start decaying, even if the world is indeterministic. It just randomly, spontaneously happens. Okay. So you don't have to think that there are probabilities governing every action if you're an indeterminist. So even if he means governed by probabilities, this is false, she thinks. Okay. Now, she says, set that aside. Let's pretend every action, even if indeterminism is true, everything's governed by probabilities. Let's pretend that's true. Even if that's true, then this would be false. Okay. So if it's not true, then this is false. If not everything is governed by probabilities, then this would be false. But even if it is true, then this would be false. Why? Oops. Because nothing about probabilities makes them purposeless, unguided, haphazard. So if an act is governed by probabilities, if that's what we mean by chance, right, then the action's not free. She's like, wait a minute. Just because an action is governed by probabilities, that doesn't mean it's purposeless. That doesn't mean it's unguided. That doesn't mean it's haphazard or random. It just means that we could have done otherwise with some other probability based on the reasons we have now. She admits, like, look, I'm exactly the same way. The history of the world up to my decision is exactly the same way. But I can do A or I can do B. That doesn't mean A and B aren't free. That's just what it means for me to have indeterministic probabilities of what I'll do. It just means I could have done something else. My action was not guaranteed. It was not a probability of 1. And my alternative action was not a probability of 0, right? There's some probability, 50-50, 90-10, whatever it is. Actions governed by probabilities doesn't mean it's purposeless. See, remember this one. That's why I switched them. Doesn't mean it's purposeless. It doesn't mean it's unguided, haphazard. That's just what indeterminism is. It just means I could have done otherwise based on the actual reasons and motivations that I had. All right. So she thinks we can reject B. But we might wonder, we might ask Ekstrom, is that really the worry? Is being governed by probabilities, is Van Inwagen's worry here, if an act is a matter of chance, then it's not free? Is his worry here really that being governed by probabilities means that your action is purposeless or unguided or haphazard? Maybe, but what does that mean? What would Van Inwagen mean if he thought being governed by probabilities means your action's unguided? Well, remember, contrastive explanations, that disappearing agent objection, where if you're exactly the same with exactly the same history and circumstances in two possible worlds, but one world you do A and one world you do B, the worry that we've talked about for a couple weeks now is not that we look at one world where you do A and say, oh, you didn't do A for any reason. Oh, you didn't do A in a guided way. It wasn't cause, or it was, oh, just haphazard that you did A in that world. No, we're looking across the worlds. Why are you in A world? Why are you in the world where you did A rather than the world where you did B? Because you're exactly the same in both worlds. And the history of the world up to the moment of your decision is exactly the same. Now, the question is not, did you do A for a reason? Can we explain why you did A? That's not the question from the worrier of luck. The question is, what explains why you did A rather than doing B? And if you did B, what explains why you did B rather than doing A? And the worry was not that you didn't do A for a reason. It might be that it's unguided or haphazard, but then what she's saying here is wrong. Nothing about probabilities makes them unguided or haphazard. Really? What if we think about that in terms of contrastive explanations? If there just isn't anything about you that can contrastively explain why you did A rather than doing B, then it does seem haphazard. At least that's the objection. And so one might think she doesn't really address the luck objection here, not at least in the way that it's sometimes formulated. Maybe she addresses some kind of worry with luck. All right, we can't explain A at all. We can't explain why you did A. Okay, well, maybe we can. You still did A for reasons, and your motivations like justify you doing A or make sense of you doing A. Just the same way that those same set of reasons justify and explain why you did B. Because remember, we can be torn about what we want to do, we can be indecisive. But that's not what we're trying to explain. We're not trying to explain why you did A. You had lots of reasons to do A. We're not trying to explain why you did B. You had lots of reasons to do B. We can make sense of doing A and we can make sense of doing B. What we can't make sense of, the luck argument says, is why you did A rather than B. That's what we can't make sense of. And nothing about you explains that because you're exactly the same in both worlds. And therefore, that's what seems like a matter of chance because we can't contrastively explain your actions. Now, she can get rid of contrastive explanations if she wants. That seems counterintuitive. She doesn't really address that, but that's the whole point. She doesn't really seem to address what some people might consider the real luck worry, or at least she doesn't address the entire luck worry. Okay, so that's a question you might ask yourself. All right, so let's wrap up. Here's some things to think about. What is Mysterianism? Remember the motivation. Why does she even write this chapter in the first place? What is supposed to be mysterious about free will, and in particular about libertarian free will? Hey, an important key to the an important key to the Mysterian argument, the Mysterian view, is that the world has to be either deterministic or indeterministic. Remember that key. It's got to be one of those. So then why is free will a mystery? Because you can't have free will here and you can't have free will here. But we do have free will, right? So there's a mystery in the contradictory conclusion. We can be free, but we're not free. But there's also this different mystery in how to resolve it, right? So there's a mystery in. Let me make that a little bit more clear. Hopefully, there's a mystery here. How can both? Gosh dang it! How can both of these be true? How can it be true that we do have free will and we don't have free will? That's a mystery. But there's also a mystery in the idea that this is true and this needs to be false, but we can't see how to make it false. That's also a mystery. They're intertwined. You might even think that this was the same mystery described in two ways, but just pointing out that you start with a mystery once you get the argument. You're like, wait a minute, here's the argument. Okay, this seems good. This seems good. Good. Now we conclude we don't have free will. But wait a minute, we have evidence to think we do have free will. Uh-oh, we have a contradiction. That's mysterious. But then you add to the mystery by saying, well, how do we get out of this mystery? Well, we have to either reject this or reject this. Can't reject that because we're really, really confident that we have free will. Can we reject this? Well, there's nothing wrong with these arguments. Consequence argument, luck argument. Therefore, what do we do? Well, I'm not giving this up. Now I need to give this up by objecting to one of these. But remember, Van Inwagen said, now I have to reject one or two without any good reason to do so. And that is also a mystery. Okay. All right. So, right, the mystery of we're free but we're not free, and then the mystery of the arguments are really good, but we're supposed to reject one. That's mysterious. All right. So, what's the dual component? conception of free will. Keep that in mind. That's really central to her view. She thinks that that helps support her view. The fact that everyone thinks this about free will supports her view against Mysterianism. Okay, this question. Does the fact that everyone has this idea, this core idea of free will, does that mean it's not a mystery? She seems to think so. Well, you might ask, is the mystery really about what free will means? How we understand it? Whether everyone can kind of similarly make sense of the idea of what free will is supposed to be, even if they disagree about the details? Is that the mystery? That doesn't seem to be the mystery of agent causal power. The mystery of agent causal power is what the hell is this power and how do we make sense of it in a scientific world? Right? A naturalistic scientific worldview. How do we make sense of that? That's mysterious. What's also mysterious is how these arguments lead to a conclusion that we think we're supposed to reject. And it's not clear that that has anything to do with understanding what free will means. That's just, you can't have free will, even when everyone agrees on what it means. The mystery is there's arguments against that thing that seem to work, but we seem to have that thing, free will. That's the mystery. So the mystery, it's not clear if the mystery is what free will means, rather than the mystery being how can we have free will if we have these really good arguments, both that it exists and that it doesn't exist. Okay. So then also think about how she fills in her components. Obviously, what is her view of free will? So she has the dual component view. How does she fill in those components? What does she mean by acting autonomously or self-determined? Right? What part of our psychology does she focus on as being like truly us? What's a preference? How's it different from a desire? That's part of her view. What does it mean for a preference to be coherent? If you want to talk about her view, you're going to have to understand these things. So make sure you think about these questions and whether you can answer them. And then how does she fill in the alternative possibilities component? Like, where do they go? That's an important part of her view. What does she think about PVI's argument? How does she try to solve it? We just went through that. So make sure you understand the argument. First of all, what is the Mysterian argument and how does it work? Right? Why does she try to address the luck argument and not the consequence argument or the fact that we have free will? Why does she do that? What is she trying to be? And then ask me if you don't understand this, email or office hours. What is her strategy? What is the strategy for addressing the luck, the chance argument? Right? The strategy of she considers these three different conceptions of chance. Why is that relevant to addressing the argument? Like, what is she doing there? Why does chance have to make sense? And why does showing that we can't make those premises true, like, what's the strategy there? I started to give some of it away, but okay. Last thing, what can people say in response to Ekstrom? Think about that. What would PVI say? Van Inwagen. What would he say? What would a skeptic say? What do you think? Is there anything wrong with her arguments, with any of the moves that she's making? I raised a couple worries that aren't in the chapter as we went along. Maybe think about those. Think about, oh, you might think, oh, that's a good worry that I raised, but maybe you think Ekstrom can respond to the worry I raised. So you can think about that too. Does she really avoid or answer the worries, or is she addressing something else? Are there worries that are really there that she doesn't really address? Is she missing the point? Is she missing the target? And then again, this is just part of that. That second well, I should change that now. The third understanding of chance above, it's the second in the chapter, but the third listed here because I think it's ordered better that way. Does it really escape the luck objection? Remember, she's like, probability, if you understand chance as just being governed by probabilities, that doesn't mean our actions aren't free because they can still be purposeful. It doesn't make them random. They're still done for reasons. Does that really escape the luck objection? Is that really what it's about? Isn't it about the agent not being part of the explanation? Isn't it about contrastive explanations? Think about that. All right, that will be it for today. Thanks.